Why is shame such a powerful emotion? How does it affect us mentally, physically, emotionally? I'm Nadia Davis. I'm a mom, author, attorney, and Kundalini yoga teacher who has experienced public shaming that brought me to my knees. On this podcast, I'm going to tell you how I'm living the work taking shame out of the shadows. I'll give you real-life advice and skills to take away with you throughout your day. You'll hear from powerful guests who have overcome trauma and emerged stronger than ever. You too can ban the shame within and around you. Join me. You are not alone. Hi, everyone. It's Nadia, and I am here with special guest Dr. Abbie Marono. This is the first podcast interview in the new year and in this new home that I'm in. And so having her today is so symbolic of the fact that here at this podcast, we empower trauma and addiction recovery by choosing to drag shame out of the shadows and the cracks of our own psyches and figure out how to transform it into healing power. So today we're going to hear from, she's an expert, a scientist in the field of human behavior. And I ask you to ponder, what is the relationship between shame and empowerment? What are the myths about shame and empowerment? How does the social media culture influence it? And how can we empower ourselves to move beyond shame and start to build a solid sense of a home within ourselves so that we can recognize when others are in shame and projecting and navigate society, social media, family, friends, difficult people and situations gracefully, connected to our true self, and just continue to use those as opportunities to deepen our spiritual connection to our true self. I'm going to give Abbie's bio, but I also really want to get into her personal story of how she got into this work, how she grew up, before we get into some of the deeper questions. So welcome, Dr. Abbie. I'm super happy that you're here.
I'm super excited to be here.
Now listen to this bio, okay? Dr. Abbie Marono, do you use an Enye?
Yeah, so Maroño.
Maroño is a distinguished scientist and practitioner in human behavior, recognized by the U.S. Department of State as a top 1% expert in this area. She's provided specialized behavior analysis training to elite units, including the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, which I know an old boss of mine was super passionate about. That force comprises agents from the Secret Service, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and local law enforcement. She earned her PhD in psychology. She became a professor of psychology at the age of 23. She now serves as Director of Education at Social Engineer, LLC, specializing in behavior analysis. She does behavior analysis in a variety of ways, and I'm going to ask her a little bit more about that work. It includes expert witness testimony, in-depth body language analysis. Really, I want to dive deep into how she analyzes and finds insights into behavioral patterns and nonverbal communication associated with both criminal activity and post-trauma responses. If anyone listening knows my story, you would understand why this is just fascinating to me with fascinating questions. So She's also been featured on BBC News, Wired, and Forbes Breaking News. As an active member of internationally recognized research groups, Abbie was honored as Reviewer of the Year for her significant contribution to this academic community. She is an author, expert consultant, coach, and a TEDx speaker. And I'm super happy to have you here today. How were your holidays?
My holidays were great, thank you. It's great to be here. It is great to get back to the normal flow of work. It was nice. I did take a couple of days off, but I'm working on a new book, so my holidays weren't as relaxing as I would have liked, mostly writing, but
Yeah.
it was so nice to have that break.
And where are you located?
I live in Orlando.
Okay. Oh, one of my kids just won a trip there and was elated.
Yeah,
So
it is amazing here.
good. Okay. We'll have to ask you for tips on where to go. So I just read this very, extensive, elaborate bio. What does it feel like to hear it read?
It's a really strange feeling. I never really had a lot of self belief growing up, and I really had everyone tell me I couldn't do it. The things that I wanted to do, there was a lot of, you're too ambitious, you're too this. And I never really felt like anything I did was good enough. And I
Hmm.
did come from a broken family and a difficult upbringing. And I changed a lot in a really short period of time. So I really went from just someone that was very lost and feeling alone and didn't feel like I'd accomplished anything to a few years later having achieved so many dreams. So it feels a bit surreal sometimes when I think about the things that I have achieved. It almost feels like there's versions of me that I know are me, but I'm so disconnected from them that it's like
Hmm.
another person sometimes.
So, do you speak to the little girl within you, and did it take building a relationship with that and kind of understanding the the core beliefs? You work a lot on shame, so like what is the organic kind of passion and experience that you know motivated that?
Well, for me, it was always nothing I did ever felt like it was enough. I always felt like I had to achieve more to have some kind of value. And I never stopped to celebrate any win. I remember I finished my PhD and that should have been the biggest celebration, but it was like, okay, what's next? What do I do next? And it's always about what do I achieve next? I'd come off stage after doing a speech and I should have this moment of extreme happiness, but instead it's just a moment of, well, how do I get another one? How do I do something bigger? So instead of the happiness and celebration, there would actually be a sadness there. And
Mm.
when I would achieve something, instead of feeling great, I would still feel like I'm not enough because I would instantly adjust the scale of that you need to do something bigger now. And
So what
it
were
took
I'm
me,
going to stop you there for a second and ask you to go like to your little girl in childhood and for the
yeah,
listeners kind of describe the thoughts that would pop up early on, that you now know were shame based. Was it,
yeah. Well, it
like a
took me a little bit
separation?
of
Was it-
time. When I
Mhm.
realized this, that I was kind of coming off stage and feeling negative when I should have felt positive, I really had to sit with that and say, where is this coming from? And it took me a bit of time to figure out that the way that I was speaking to myself really was how my mum would speak to me.
Okay.
And I kind of had to reverse it back. And when I was 15, I was starting to get involved in some really heavy drugs. And I ended up having a really serious drug addiction at 16 years old. And I remember I got my life clean. Again, still 16. I managed to pull myself kind of out of it. But after that point, I still couldn't get anything right at home. If I wouldn't drink, my mum would call me a prude. If I would drink, my mum would call me a mess and a failure. I said if I wanted to go to uni, then it was, you think you're better than us. If I didn't go to uni,
Uh-huh.
I was lazy and a failure. If I didn't eat enough, I was anorexic. If I ate too much, be careful. You want to look good, you want to be skinny. So didn't really matter what I did. There was always, you're doing it wrong. You're not good enough. And the way that my mum would speak to me was very demeaning. And I made that my inner voice because when we're kids, we learn how to treat ourselves based on the love that we're given in the home. So when you
Mhm.
have really loving and warm and inviting parents, they teach you that emotional regulation, they teach you how to love yourself. I was around a lot of very toxic relationships. My mum was very psychologically and verbally abusive and emotionally. My dad struggled with his mental health and he was in an abusive relationship. My mum was in a series of abusive relationships. So the love coming towards me and all the love that I witnessed was very either violent or very just abusive. So I learned that that's how we speak to loved ones, and thus that's how I speak to myself. And we get familiar with the way that we think and the way that we speak to ourselves. So we don't realize it's abnormal. And that's
Right.
why these patterns can continue. And for me, this deep self hatred and this deep, you're just not good enough no matter what you do, was so normal that for
Mhm.
me to think about someone else not perceiving themselves that way, that's a
Right.
very strange thing. And it was
Right.
only as I got into healthier relationships and healthier places and started to have good people around me for the first time, they're like, that's not healthy. That's not normal. And I thought that it was my superpower. I thought that this demeaning way of speaking to myself is the way that kept me successful. So I was like, no, no, I love this because it keeps me going, it keeps me pushing. And actually, what it was that wound, like you said, from how I was treated as a child. And I was just staying in that cycle of really negative self talk and really self demeaning speech to myself.
So, in a question that I asked prior to this interview, I asked, "Why is shame such a powerful emotion?" And your answer was so compellingly short. I loved it. It was because it evolved to be so.
Yeah.
And that resonated with me a lot because I always try to put in words, shame is the spiritual warfare and our minds are survivalist. And I have this terminology that may not be digestible
Yeah.
for people. And, you know, um, so that's why I try to get guests and why I try to share what it feels like, what that secret belief you're defective feels like and drag it out. And so in your sharing your story right now and not knowing that it wasn't normal,
Yeah.
um, is fascinating. So how how do you think, or why is it that some brains evolve that way and others don't, aside from the messages that we're hearing as children? The science part behind it, I'm not a doctor, but when I say our minds are survivalist, that as children, our minds like latched on to these thoughts and it thinks and it behaves right as though it's helping
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
So
So,
is that what you think happened with you? And how
so
does shame
all of our
evolve to be so?
all of our brains evolved in the same way. We're all, although we're very different, we're fundamentally identical. Genetically, human beings are so similar. There is a 0.1% difference between us. So our brains have all evolved in an identical way, and shame serves the same function for every single brain. The reason that the differences in childhood had such a different effect on different individuals is because if you look at the brain of a human versus, say, our closest ancestors like chimps or bonobos, really the differences are that their brains are completely genetic, meaning the brain that they have really isn't going to change that much throughout their life. It is what it is. With human beings, as we grow up, our brain morphology, so the structure and function of different regions, they can change, and they change through experience. And in the first period of our life, so really from infancy to 2 years old, and then from 2 years old to 25 years old, we have a huge amount of brain development. So, as our brain is saying, how am I going to look for the rest of your life? What patterns am I going to create? What triggers am I going to have? How am I really going to function? Things like memory, things
Uh-huh.
like, okay, what's your emotional control? How well developed your emotional center is going to be? Those things are really fundamentally based on the experiences that we have in our early life. And
Okay.
that's the difference. It's not that our brains have evolved differently, it's that all of our brains have evolved to adapt to our experiences. So, for example, if you go through verbal abuse when you're young, centers of your brain that control the gray matter of the hippocampus, so learning and memory, things like that, can reduce. So you have a lower ability to have better recall. You don't have as well functioning prefrontal cortex and emotional centers. So things like that, where it changes, it doesn't change the region itself. It's still there. You're not going to get rid of or get rid of brain regions, but you can change how they function and how they activate. And that's why it's so important in the early years of our life that we're taught the importance of emotional regulation, that we're taught the positive self talk, and we're really taught how to love ourselves, because that becomes the foundation now of how we understand the world. Because if we think about it, the brain really is just the source of all thinking. So if I'm looking to, okay, well, how do I interact with the world? What should I expect people to give to me? What should I expect to give to people? That is going to be based on how my brain says that I should expect it, because we ultimately are our brains. And if my brain has learned that, okay, say I look at every relationship growing up, like I said, mine were violent. So I go, okay, well, this is a loving relationship because this is mother father. So this means that love is violence. So my brain, they say neurons that wire together, fire together, wire together. My brain goes, okay, so we have this. This is love and this is violence. We're going to put these together. So now, as I grow up, because I've learned this pattern, I start to see a little bit of violence, and I might go, no, that's okay, because this is love, because this is what my brain has learned. But if you've grown up in a happy childhood, if I see that pattern, someone starts to become violent to me, my brain goes, no, no, no. We've learned that love is kindness and softness. This doesn't fit the pattern of what we recognize. So we make it go away. So that's why
So
those
how
early
is it
experiences are so
though
important.
that so many I didn't experience violence in my childhood. I experienced a molestation. And then later in life I was assaulted, and yes, my brain did immediately, now when I think about it, react in a way that it knew it wasn't right, but there was still this part, and I think this is very common in women. There's this part of the brain that, yes, this isn't right, yet there's this drive to understand why a person was violent, and this thing like, oh, they're going to be all alone, or they don't have
Mhm.
anyone else. This self-sacrifice thing. And I could see where that came from in childhood and comes for other women, but to work on the shame as a result of being the victim of violence, if someone had not experienced violence in childhood, what would you say to that?
Well, firstly, I'm really sorry for the experiences that you've gone through. Even when you have moved past them, it doesn't make it any easier. So I appreciate you being so open to talk about them, because I know they're not easy things to talk about.
Thank you.
Um, but there is a real sense of failure when it comes to our experiences. We feel like we have failed when we allow people to treat us badly sometimes. And that's where shame comes through from.
Mhm.
So there's no one cause of something for everyone. So maybe some people's shame comes from self doubt or self sabotage. But patterns say someone who has gone through abuse and they didn't experience it later, that shame can come from a sense of broken identity. So maybe I know for
Right.
me, when I experienced sexual assault myself, I grew up believing I was a strong woman, believing I was someone who stood their ground. And I've always been that way. I speak my mind. I have no problem saying what I think. And I let someone take that from me and I didn't fight back. And that's where my shame came from because it broke my sense of identity.
I see.
And for me, it was, I thought that I was this one thing. And because of this thing that I allowed to happen to me, I must be something else. And I felt like I had failed as a person. I was not strong at this weakness. And we have this real broken sense of self sometimes and we self blame. And then we also have a broken worldview. So maybe it was someone that you knew and trusted. And then you have this broken worldview of, well, I thought the danger was the man hiding in the street corner. And actually,
Mhm.
maybe the danger is someone that I invited into my home.
Right.
And sadly, most of the time when it's children and there's molestation, it's a family member. And that breaks your sense of who is safe, who is not.
Right.
And all of these things compile to this broken worldview. And it makes us feel like we are not good enough, that we are broken, and that we are tainted. And what happens with shame is shame comes from this sense of self, of
Mhm.
something about me is inherently wrong. Something
Right.
with my core sense of self is inherently wrong. So when bad things happen to us, we have this really negative but common tendency to associate the things that have been done to us as reflective of who we are. Because, or maybe we've made a mistake and we think that it makes us a failure instead of a bad thing happened to me or I did a bad thing. Instead, we think I am bad. And that's really what happens sometimes when we go through these really horrible experiences. We internalize the blame as I am somehow at fault. And there's a huge culture of victim blaming. And when we're already struggling with, did I do something to make this
Cause
happen?
this
Or did
pain.
I not do enough to make it go away? And then everybody else is saying, hey, it's your fault. It's very, very difficult not to internalize that blame. And just
And
to
also the
add,
responses of victims
yeah,
when they are struggling, when they're emotional, when they relapse or
yeah,
whatever they might be doing, the instability as a result of the abuse.
yeah.
It's not just
And a
victim
lot of it,
blaming, it's really victim shaming.
yeah, both, absolutely. And a lot of it comes from not understanding. And this
Mhm.
is why I dived into this work, because if you don't understand an emotion, you can't remedy it. And I felt so much shame. I said I had this broken sense of self because how could I call myself a strong woman if I didn't fight? It was, I'd cried and I had begged, get off, and I had verbalized no, but I didn't fight. And for me, that's out of character not to fight back. So, and I couldn't understand it. So it was when I dived into the science of trauma responses. And what I learned was we have an innate ability or an innate response called the freeze response. Most of us know fight and flight, but there is a third, and it's freeze. When we're in a situation and the brain goes, can I fight my way out? Or can I run? And if neither of those two things seem like a viable option, the brain will go, okay, well, maybe if I go completely immobilized, if I stay completely still, this threat will go away.
Right.
So, what happens then is our nervous system, and we cannot control this, it is automatic, our nervous system will shut down. It immobilizes us. And what happens too is part of the brain called Broca's area can reduce in activity, meaning it becomes nearly impossible to vocalize. So having to scream can be physically impossible because that part of the brain says, I don't know what to do. We're frozen. So you're
Right.
thinking to yourself, you're almost locked in this body of, why aren't I fighting? Why aren't I screaming? But the brain just says, no, the safest thing for you to do is stay immobilized. And when I learned that, and
Yes.
I realized, you know what? It wasn't weakness. What happened was my brain was doing the best that it could to keep me surviving. It did
Right.
what it's evolved to do. And I think that's a strength, to fight until your last breath. And that really is what it was trying to do. And I learned that. And then I realized I didn't feel as much shame, because I was like, maybe it's not a personal failing.
Right.
Maybe it's just an automatic response that I have
Right.
no control over.
Exactly. I often say we are not a body, nor the thoughts our mind makes. And in this example, in this information that you're giving us, it applies, because we are not the thoughts that made us freeze, right? We are souls in a body, and our true selves are not changed by anything anyone has said or done to us. And yet, um, on the opposite end, we hear that, we are our thoughts and our brain. So I think it's just the lack of the information and the lack of experts like you speaking for the victim responses, um, versus the investigative community looking at the responses and using it as kind of fodder to prove, oh, she asked for it, he asked for it.
Yeah.
Um, have you experienced that in your work, and how are you breaking into the field to, or how have you, to speak for the victim responses and reduce the investigative uh, judgment of
Yep.
them? Is that a big thing that you've seen?
Yeah. So I was recently an expert witness for a high profile celebrity sexual assault case, the McGregor case in Dublin recently. I was on the
Mhm.
side of Nikita Hand, who he had sexually assaulted, and her behavior on CCTV was shown. And she couldn't understand why she was behaving the way that she did. And when the CCTV was shown, I could see that the jury was thinking, she's guilty, she's lying, because that's really strange behavior. And I could see the judge a little bit like looking at it strange. And her, I was watching her, and she could not understand why she had behaved the way that she had
Right.
after the assault had occurred. And I was looking at it, and I wanted to stand up and scream, because to me, I wanted to say, do you not understand? She's in a freeze response. She is fawning. These are evolved tendencies. She is having delayed emotional processing. These are things that are naturally occurring after trauma. This is how the brain copes with trauma.
Yes.
And luckily, her team had amazing experts, and she did win. But I realized then that it's not that the information doesn't exist, because there are incredible experts in the field. It's that
Mhm.
it's not always accessible. And we were talking
Oh,
before this, and really my motto is making science accessible. And what that means in this field to me is there is so much science out there on post trauma behavior, so much that victims need and authorities need. And I'm going out to
thank you for
um,
saying all of
do
this. Yes, yes,
yeah,
yes.
I'm
You're going.
out training law enforcement in a couple of months, who are responsible for dealing with cases of sexual assault, and they want to improve the criminal justice system. So, detectives, investigators, and judges. And I'm teaching post trauma behavior because, like I said, the information's out there, but it isn't always accessible to non scientists. And that's the problem. So I'm trying to take the science
Who?
of post trauma and make
Yes.
the layperson, the victim, the investigator, the detective understand that these responses that may seem abnormal aren't. Because we
Mhm.
have this script of how someone who is traumatized should behave. You
Hmm.
should be very emotional. You can't be cold. You have to, if say you've been sexually assaulted, you have to refrain from sex. Otherwise, if you have sex with someone else, obviously you are lying. We have these scripts
Yes.
and they're so inaccurate because that is just not how human behavior occurs. For example, someone who has been raped, one thing that for them is huge is their sense of control and their sense of autonomy over their own body has been taken. So, psychologically, when someone makes an advance to them, they think, well, if I say no, they're going to take it anyway. So, I'm going to say yes because I don't want to
Right.
re experience the rape. And then, what can happen psychologically is because they've lost a sense of control, we try to regain it. So, they can go hypersexual and they can
Yes.
engage in multiple sexual partners and really go on this cycle of extreme sexual behavior. And to a courtroom, that can look guilty. Why would they be doing that if they've just been raped? But actually, it's a defense mechanism after we experience trauma. And these things are so important, but they're just not really spoken about because they don't fit the script of how a traumatized person should behave. Like again, if someone's
Yes.
cold, pardon,
Thank you
sorry.
so much for this work. No, it's you're right on point. When I was interviewed by the state attorney general's office because my assault, there was a conflict in the DA's office because I had worked for her. So it was delayed and delayed. And when I was in trauma and addiction treatment, I got back a month after and I was so overwhelmed with the news
Mhm.
articles. And I was interviewed by an investigator, and uh, it was very difficult to do the interview, but at the end, I was asked, and one of them kept telling the other to be quiet, but I was asked, um, and what were you wearing?
Yeah, yeah,
And in the shock and state that I was in at the time, I thought nothing was odd about that question because I thought they were there to help me and to, get evidence to get and it wasn't until I did what you have explained. It wasn't until a few years where I came a little bit more and more, and then a dozen years, 10 years into who I am and my true self and my truth of an infinite being, whole, divine, and complete, that it hadn't
mhm,
changed because of the abuses in the past, nor what was said. To even look back and ponder, you know what? How dare them ask me what I was
yeah,
wearing? I could have been naked. Does that mean I deserve to be strangled and my head bashed against the floor? So it took my own journey to
yeah,
look back and be like, wow, today I'd be in that room if I'm an attorney. And if someone asked a client that question, it blew my mind. And it may sound so insignificant to people, but what someone is wearing is absolutely irrelevant to the fact
yeah,
that another would choose to violently assault them. And yeah, so what you're saying right now to get more information out there to the general public about behaviors post trauma um, is really really important, and I don't see a lot of it out there. I love that you're doing the in field trainings too. And is there other entities that are doing your work? I do know the whole victims' rights community has really, really evolved and expanded. But the science-based experts, have you seen growth, or do you feel kind of like a needle in a haystack? Tell me
a,
your
a bit
professional
of both.
challenges.
I think I see a lot in the sciences.
Hmm.
but I don't often see as much kind of coming out of the sciences. And it is a very difficult field to get people to listen to, because people have this, like I said, the script. And to
Mhm.
break people's general idea is really difficult. So to go into law enforcement and say, hey, you're doing things wrong, is a really difficult thing to do, because they don't always want to listen. And sometimes it's not that they don't want to listen, it's just, no, no, this is how we've done it for this long, so this must be right.
So
And
did
it's
you
like
testify in that case?
I was hired as an expert witness.
And so they heard that this behavior, any of the victims' responses, they heard the explanation of the science and how the brain works. And
Yeah, there was a lot of amazing experts that had explained the science behind her behavior, and that made all the difference, because once we understand something, it's like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And that's why I say you can't remedy an emotion if you don't understand it. So if you're
okay,
feeling, say, shame or self-doubt, and all you're doing is feeling it and you're saying, how do I make it go away? If you don't understand what the function of that emotion is and where it comes from, how can you make it go away? And if you don't, the only way we can make it go away is through maladaptive practices. We escape it, we run from it, we drink, we do behaviors that distract us from it. So it doesn't really go away. We're just moving away from it. And when it comes to law enforcement and this post trauma behavior, a lot of the issues, when say the questioning, it doesn't always come from malintent. So that question of what are you wearing? It might be that that investigator really believes, okay, well, this is the right question to ask, because maybe they did spur it on. And that doesn't necessarily come
I
from
understand.
malintent, but it can come from a lack of education, because maybe they do think, well, if you do these things, you're going to increase your likelihood of being raped. And this is going to increase a rapist's desire to do this to you. And actually, that is just not the case. It really has no effect what clothes you're wearing on your statistical likelihood of being raped whatsoever. And it has been shown time and time and time again. But for an investigator who believes that that is an important factor, they'll ask that question. So, like I said, I don't always think that it comes from purposeful victim
Malintent.
blaming.
Hmm.
Sometimes it comes from a wide societal misunderstanding. And on a topic such as sexual assault, it's a very difficult one for people to talk about. And a lot of people don't feel comfortable talking about it. Even in the field, a lot of people really shy away from being open and honest because it is such a difficult topic. But we need to open those doors. And part of
Yeah, I
that
don't
is also
necessarily think
talking
it was
about their
malintent. I
experience.
think you're absolutely on point that it's the societal wider
Yeah.
uh, foundation
Yeah.
that we're changing, that you're working to change. So if um so for listeners, I mean, the fact that you empowered yourself and you transformed your own shame-based thoughts into this powerful work today, um how then, what are your top three tips
Hmm.
for women um, to understand the emotion of shame, and then to get to transform it into power?
So, firstly, I would say don't run from it. That's the first tip. When we feel really negative and overwhelming emotions, it is so human to want to make it go away. We feel pain. We don't want to feel pain. Of course, we don't want to feel it. So we want to distract ourselves from it. We want to run from it. Maybe that is we get into a relationship that may not be right for us, because when we're in that relationship, we don't have to really think about our emotions. We have to think about our own, isolated time, because we have no time to be on our own with our thoughts. And it's a really normal thing. And I say there's three routes. We can escape them, we can suppress them, or we can heal them. And heal them means feel them. So don't
Okay.
run from the pain. You gotta feel it. You cannot get rid of it in a healthy way if you do not let it in. And then understanding that we take our emotions too personally. So my second tip was your emotions are just emotions. They're not necessarily definitions of your character. So we feel shame and we go, well, I'm a failure. Or we feel fear and we go, I'm weak. I
Mm-hmm.
feel angry. I go, I'm an angry person. No, our emotions are evolved responses to the environment. You need to figure out why and what you're being triggered by. It doesn't mean that you are that emotion, but we really have a tendency to take those emotions on as part of who we are. And then, thirdly, I would say educate yourself because it's impossible to sit with emotions if you don't know what to do with them, if you don't know where they come from, if you don't know how to regulate them. Just sitting with them and go, right, I'm going to do this. You're still going to be stuck in that thinking because what do you do next?
Mm-hmm.
And there is so much information out there. A lot of it is rubbish and some of it is great. So, seeking information from reliable sources, from people who are field leaders, books and research articles and blogs from people who are leaders in the field. There's so much out there. And there's the Mind charity. They put out a lot of great resources, and there's a lot of nonprofits out there. And just seeking out that education for yourself. And I would give the same advice too for someone who isn't struggling, because we talked
What do you
about thought
think? Right.
patterns.
Go ahead.
And when we talked about thought patterns,
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily recognizing that we're in
Mm-hmm.
maladaptive thought. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, like I said, because they're just familiar to you, it's what you've always known. You might not know that what you're doing is actually really harmful for yourself. So if you just seek out information for better well-being anyway, what you might realize is, oh, what I went through was abuse. What I
Mm-hmm.
went through was negative, and you can have those realizations because we should all be working on bettering ourselves, regardless of if we've been through trauma or not. And that starts with seeking out education.
And increasing our knowledge and awareness, whether or
Absolutely.
not we're struggling, right?
Yeah. But especially if you're struggling, because it can feel so isolating. It can
Yeah.
feel, even though we know so many people suffer, doesn't make it feel any less isolating. So when
Right.
you seek out that information, it can take a lot of that self-blame away. Like I said, I sat with so much self-blame, and it was only when I learned this science that I realized it wasn't my fault. And
You
it was like,
remember that moment so much, right?
yeah,
Was it like
yeah.
a, aha, well, how old were you and where and when was it?
So it was when I was still a professor. I was ready to move to America. So it was a few years ago. And
Mm-hmm.
I was really tired of hiding from myself. I would go to sleep scared that people would find out about my past.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really living in this like shame cycle. And I would get interview requests and I would shut them down because I didn't want to grow my profile, because I didn't want people to
Yeah.
see me and then see all of my mistakes. And when I got this new job and I was about to move to America, there were so many opportunities for me to live my dream. And I said, enough is enough. I'm so tired of living like this. I need to do
And
something about
fear.
it.
Yeah.
And that was when I started writing my book, Work in Progress. And that
Yes.
was when I realized that there's so much shame that we all share. And that's why in my book, I put a lot of things that
Do you
I'm
have a
really
copy of
embarrassed.
it? Do
Yes.
you have a
Yeah.
copy of it? I share everything in Home is Within You, and it was
Yeah.
so freeing. So
It
show us a
is.
copy of your book. Do you have
Pardon?
it? Do you have your book
I
with you
do.
right
Yeah.
now? Yeah, okay, I see it. So
Yeah.
okay,
It's
so
called
tell us
Work in
tell us the
Progress.
title, tell us all about it, and tell us how it
Hi.
leads you. This
So my book is called Work in Progress, The Road to Empowerment, The Journey Through Shame. And when I was writing it, I had to be honest because I was putting information in there about my story, and a lot of it, even though the shame is gone, I'm still so embarrassed. There's things that I did that just don't reflect who I am now. But the point of the book was so no one had to be in the position that I was in, because I wanted to write the book that I needed and I wanted young women, and not just young women, young men too, because I don't think they get enough information out there about shame and emotional regulation.
absolutely.
And I wanted it to be a book that everybody could have so they could understand their emotions and learn to regulate them. And in doing so, I learned a lot about self acceptance because I realized there were things, like I said, that were embarrassing and I wanted to take them out, but it felt dishonest because how could I take those things out and then ask people to do the hard work? Why would anybody listen to me? I had to embody my own message. And that was very uncomfortable for me because I am a private person and I'm about to spill all of my secrets, but it's what needed to be done. And in doing so, when I released that, I released myself from their grip because they really had me in a chokehold of these things that I did. I can't be who I want to be because of these things that I did. They're holding me back. And when I took control and I gave them to everybody else, I realized you can't use me against me
Yes.
because I accept me. And that was so freeing. And I want everybody else to get to that point because that's what I define empowerment as. There's so many different messages of empowerment, but my definition of empowerment is you can't use me against me. And that's empowering.
I accept all of me and take me as I am, or you're out. My sister used to say. So your message is so amazingly powerful. And I can't thank you enough for your work. I definitely would like to interview again. And
Absolutely.
yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so, so much. There is a band shame tip sheet through my website that has 10 different mantras that you can use while you're using these 3 steps that Abbie suggested. And I really would love to talk and get more in depth on a lot of things with you. But our time has run out. So we will have Abbie again for sure. And just thank you so much for the work you do. You can get in touch with Abbie Maroño on Instagram and then at abbieMaroño.com. And we'll put a link to her book in the podcast episode notes. And just please, everybody, empower yourselves by educating yourself about how the brain works. And especially if you are struggling, just know that you are not those thoughts, that you are whole, divine, and complete in your truest form, and you are not alone. Okay. Thank you so much for being here, Abbie.
Thank you so much for having me.
You are not alone. If you are dealing with shame and trauma, please reach out to me through my website, nadia-davis.com. You can get a free band shame tip sheet and find out about upcoming events. I'd love it if you picked up my book, Home is Within You, wherever books are sold. If you like this podcast, please tell a friend, leave a review, and make sure to follow me on Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Sending warm hugs.